The year was 1916, and the Great War had already claimed millions of souls across the battlefields of Europe. But in the muddy, blood-soaked trenches that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, something far more terrifying than death itself was beginning to emerge. Soldiers who had witnessed horrors beyond human comprehension were transforming into something that defied every convention of warfare. They became living nightmares that haunted both enemy and ally alike. What you're about to discover goes far beyond the sanitized history taught in classrooms. This isn't just another recounting of battles and casualty figures. This is the story of how the First World War created the most psychologically devastating fighting forces in human history. Men who had stared so long into the abyss of industrial slaughter that they became the abyss itself. Throughout this investigation, we'll uncover three distinct categories of these terrifying soldiers. First, the shock troops who emerged from the German trenches like demons from hell, using tactics so brutal they redefined the very nature of combat. Second, the tunneling companies who fought their wars in the darkness beneath no man's land, creating underground battlefields that resembled nothing less than Dante's vision of the underworld. And finally, the most disturbing of all, the psychological casualties who had broken so completely that they became weapons of terror in their own right, spreading fear through their very presence on the battlefield. But before we dive into these accounts, you need to understand something crucial. The evidence I'm presenting comes from declassified military reports, personal diaries that were hidden for decades, and testimony from survivors who were sworn to secrecy until long after the war ended. What emerges from these sources is a picture of warfare so intense, so psychologically damaging, that it created soldiers who were no longer entirely human in any conventional sense. The Western Front in 1916 had become a killing machine of unprecedented efficiency. Artillery barrages that lasted for days, poison gas attacks that turned men's lungs into liquid fire, and machine gun emplacements that could cut down entire battalions in minutes. But it was the psychological pressure that created the most terrifying transformation. Soldiers who survived months in this hell developed abilities that seemed almost supernatural. They could move through no man's land without making a sound, appear and disappear like phantoms, and kill with a cold efficiency that unnerved even their own officers. Let me start with the German Stoßtruppen, the stormtroopers who would become the template for every elite military unit that followed. But these weren't the highly trained professionals we might imagine today. These were men who had been systematically brutalized by trench warfare until they had transcended normal human limitations through sheer psychological adaptation to horror. The transformation began in the winter of 1916, when German High Command realized that traditional infantry tactics were completely obsolete. The war had become a stalemate of unprecedented proportions, with both sides losing hundreds of thousands of men for gains measured in yards rather than miles. Something had to change, and that something would emerge from the most damaged soldiers in the German army. Captain Wilhelm Rohr, a veteran who had already survived 2 years of continuous combat, was selected to develop new assault tactics. But Rohr understood something that his superiors didn't. The war wasn't just changing military strategy, it was changing the men themselves. The soldiers who had survived the longest weren't just experienced, they were fundamentally different from the men who had marched off to war in 1914. Rohr began selecting volunteers from men who had already been declared psychologically unfit for normal military service, shell shock cases who exhibited violent tendencies, soldiers who had been caught engaging in disturbing behavior during quiet periods, men who seemed to have lost their capacity for normal human emotion, but retained their tactical intelligence and fighting ability. These were the raw materials from which the first stormtroopers were forged. The training was unlike anything attempted in military history up to that point. Rather than trying to restore these men to normal psychological function, Rohr embraced their damage and weaponized it. The training camps were established in areas where the sound of constant artillery fire could be maintained around the clock. Trainees were kept in a state of permanent stress, fed irregular meals, and subjected to surprise attacks at all hours of the day and night. But the psychological conditioning went far deeper than simple stress inoculation. The men were trained to move through environments that would break normal soldiers completely. They practiced combat in rooms filled with the corpses of enemy dead, learning to fight while surrounded by the smell of rotting flesh and the sound of rats feeding on human remains. They were conditioned to find comfort in chaos, to feel most alert and capable when operating in conditions that would drive ordinary men insane. The weapons training focused on close quarters combat with an emphasis on silent killing. Knives, clubs, sharpened entrenching tools, and improvised weapons made from scavenged battlefield debris. But more than the weapons themselves, it was the mindset that made these men so terrifying. They were taught to view enemy soldiers not as fellow human beings, but as obstacles to be removed with maximum efficiency and minimum emotion. By early 1917, the first stormtrooper units were ready for combat deployment. The initial reports from officers who witnessed them in action used language that seemed more appropriate for describing supernatural phenomena than military operations. These men moved through enemy trenches like a force of nature, appearing suddenly out of the darkness, eliminating resistance with brutal efficiency, and vanishing back into the chaos of battle before conventional forces could respond. Lieutenant Hans Müller, a regular army officer who fought alongside stormtroopers during the Spring Offensive of 1918, left a diary account that captures the unsettling nature of these soldiers. "They don't speak during combat," he wrote. "They communicate through hand signals and seem to anticipate each other's movements with uncanny precision. When they encounter enemy resistance, they don't react with the normal emotions of fear or anger. They simply adapt their tactics and continue forward like a machine that has encountered a minor mechanical problem." But it was their effect on enemy morale that truly demonstrated how terrifying these soldiers had become. British and French troops began reporting encounters with German soldiers who seemed to be immune to normal battlefield conditions, men who could fight effectively while wounded, who showed no reaction to artillery bombardments, and who seemed to feel no fear even when facing overwhelming odds. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Allied intelligence reports from 1917 and 1918 describe a growing phenomenon of panic among frontline troops who had encountered stormtroopers. Soldiers who had previously shown exceptional courage under fire began requesting transfers to quieter sectors. Medical officers reported an increase in cases of what they termed anticipatory shell shock among troops who hadn't yet faced stormtrooper attacks but had heard accounts from other units. What made these reports particularly disturbing was the consistent description of stormtroopers as somehow inhuman. They moved differently from normal soldiers, with a fluid, predatory grace that seemed more animal than human. They showed no interest in taking prisoners during the initial assault phases, killing wounded enemies with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to combat. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to take no satisfaction from victory, no relief from survival, and no apparent emotional response to the death and destruction around them. The transformation wasn't limited to combat effectiveness. Stormtroopers developed behavioral patterns that unnerved their own officers and support personnel. They slept in shifts, with some members of each unit remaining alert at all times. They showed little interest in normal soldier comforts like hot food, dry clothing, or letters from home. During rest periods, they would often be found sitting motionless for hours, staring into the distance with an intensity that made conversation impossible. Medical examinations revealed physical changes that seemed to accompany the psychological transformation. Stormtroopers showed altered sleep patterns, with most requiring only 3 to 4 hours of rest per night. Their reaction times had improved dramatically. often testing at levels that seemed to exceed normal human capability. Most disturbing, they showed significantly reduced pain sensitivity, often continuing to fight effectively, even after sustaining wounds that would incapacitate ordinary soldiers. The training process had created soldiers who were supremely adapted to the conditions of industrial warfare, but the adaptation had come at a cost that military authorities were only beginning to understand. These men had sacrificed their humanity to become perfect killing machines, and the transformation appeared to be irreversible. Even after the war ended, most stormtroopers found it impossible to readjust to civilian life, remaining forever changed by their systematic conditioning for violence. But the German stormtroopers were only the beginning. As other nations observed their effectiveness, similar programs began appearing in British, French, and American forces. Each military attempted to create their own version of these psychologically weaponized soldiers, often with results that were even more disturbing than the original German model. The British response came in the form of specialized units recruited from men who had already demonstrated unusual resilience to battlefield stress. But rather than the systematic conditioning employed by the Germans, British commanders focused on identifying soldiers who seemed to possess natural immunity to the psychological effects of combat. These men formed the core of raiding parties that operated in no man's land during the darkest hours of the night, engaging in close-quarters combat that required a complete suppression of normal human empathy. The selection process for these British night raiders was both more subtle and more disturbing than the German approach. Rather than attempting to break down and rebuild soldiers psychologically, British commanders simply watched their men during combat and identified those who seemed to thrive in the most horrific conditions. These were soldiers who volunteered for the most dangerous missions, who showed no visible reaction to witnessing atrocities, and who demonstrated an almost predatory enthusiasm for close-quarters killing. Captain James Thornton, who commanded one of these specialized raiding units, described the selection process in his post-war memoirs. "We weren't looking for brave men," he wrote. "Courage was common enough on the Western Front. We were looking for men who had moved beyond courage into something else entirely, men who had found a way to enjoy what the war was asking them to do." The night raids conducted by these units became legendary among both British and German forces, though for very different reasons. British commanders praised their tactical effectiveness, while German soldiers began referring to them as Die Geister, the ghosts, due to their ability to infiltrate enemy positions without detection and eliminate entire guard posts without raising an alarm. What made these raiders so effective was their complete psychological adaptation to operating in darkness. Unlike normal soldiers who found night operations stressful and disorienting, these men had learned to prefer the cover of darkness. They moved through no man's land with an intimate knowledge of every shell crater, every strand of barbed wire, every machine gun position. They had memorized the landscape of death so thoroughly that they could navigate it blindfolded. The weapons these raiders carried reflected their specialized role. Silent killing implements dominated their arsenal, modified trench knives, wire garrots, sharpened entrenching tools, and improvised clubs designed to crush skulls without making noise. But their most effective weapon was their ability to induce paralyzing terror in enemy soldiers through their mere presence. German diary entries from this period frequently describe encounters with British raiders who seemed to materialize out of the darkness like supernatural entities. Private Heinrich Kaufmann, a German machine gunner who survived a raid on his position, left an account that captures the psychological impact of these encounters. "They came from nowhere," he wrote. "One moment the trench was quiet. The next moment my comrades were dying all around me. But it wasn't the killing that broke my mind. It was the way they killed. No anger, no excitement, no human emotion at all. They moved through our trench like death itself. taking lives with the same mechanical precision a farmer uses to harvest grain. The French developed their own version of these psychological weapons in the form of units recruited exclusively from colonial troops, who had already demonstrated unusual tolerance for violence. These men, drawn primarily from French Indochina and North Africa, brought cultural perspectives on warfare that differed dramatically from European military traditions. They viewed combat not as a regrettable necessity, but as a spiritual practice that could transform the practitioner into something beyond ordinary human limitations. The French colonial assault troops developed techniques that combined traditional European military tactics with indigenous hunting and combat methods. They moved through enemy trenches using skills learned in jungle warfare, appearing and disappearing like phantoms. Their killing techniques incorporated elements of ritual that seemed designed not just to eliminate enemies, but to terrorize survivors and spread panic through enemy ranks. Lieutenant Pierre Dubois, a French officer who served alongside these colonial troops, recorded his observations in letters to his family that weren't discovered until decades after the war. "They don't fight like European soldiers," he wrote. "They fight like predators who have learned to take pleasure in the hunt. When they return from night raids, they seem more alive, more alert, as if the act of killing has energized them rather than depleted them." The psychological conditioning of French colonial troops involved practices that military censors would never have allowed to be documented officially. Survivors' accounts suggest that these men underwent ritual preparations before combat that included consuming substances designed to enhance their aggression and suppress their capacity for fear or empathy. The exact nature of these preparations remains classified, but their effects were undeniable. These soldiers developed an almost supernatural reputation among German forces facing them on the Western Front. German intelligence reports from 1917 describe French colonial troops as possessing abilities that seem to transcend normal human limitations. They could move through no man's land without triggering flares or detection devices. They seemed to anticipate German defensive measures with uncanny accuracy. Most disturbing, they appeared to be immune to the psychological effects of prolonged combat that broke down other soldiers. The American entry into the war brought yet another approach to creating psychologically weaponized soldiers. American commanders, observing the effectiveness of European specialized units, began experimenting with psychological conditioning techniques that drew heavily from emerging theories about human behavior and mental conditioning. The result was a systematic program designed to create soldiers who could function effectively in conditions that would destroy normal men psychologically. The American program differed from European approaches in its emphasis on scientific methodology. Rather than relying on intuitive selection of naturally resilient soldiers or cultural conditioning practices, American psychologists attempted to develop reproducible techniques for transforming ordinary men into psychological weapons. The program was conducted in secret facilities established far from the main training camps, staffed by specialists who had been recruited from university psychology departments and medical schools. Dr. Marcus Webb, who served as chief psychologist for one of these experimental programs, left detailed notes that were classified until the 1970s. His research focused on identifying the specific psychological mechanisms that allowed some soldiers to maintain combat effectiveness, while others broke down completely. "The human mind," he wrote, "possesses remarkable adaptive capabilities when subjected to systematic stress conditioning. We have learned to accelerate and control this adaptation process, creating soldiers who are psychologically optimized for the specific demands of modern warfare." The conditioning techniques developed in these American facilities involved systematic exposure to progressively more intense psychological stresses. Trainees were subjected to simulated combat conditions that incorporated elements designed to overwhelm normal psychological defenses. Constant noise, sleep deprivation, exposure to disturbing imagery, and carefully controlled social isolation were combined to break down existing psychological patterns and rebuild them according to military specifications. But the most disturbing aspect of the American program was its systematic approach to eliminating empathy and normal emotional responses to violence. Trainees were gradually conditioned to view enemy soldiers not as fellow human beings, but as targets to be eliminated with maximum efficiency. The process involved exposure to increasingly graphic depictions of violence, combined with rewards for demonstrating emotional detachment from human suffering. The soldiers produced by these programs demonstrated psychological profiles that seemed to represent a new category of human being entirely. They showed complete immunity to battlefield stress, unlimited tolerance for violence and death, and an ability to maintain tactical effectiveness under conditions that would render normal soldiers catatonic. But they also exhibited behavioral patterns that suggested fundamental alterations to their basic humanity. Captain Robert Sterling, who commanded one of the first American units to employ these psychologically conditioned soldiers, documented their effectiveness in combat reports that remained classified for decades. "These men represent the future of warfare," he wrote. "They possess capabilities that seem to transcend normal human limitations. They can operate effectively in any environment, under any conditions, against any enemy. They have become perfect soldiers by ceasing to be recognizably human." The deployment of these American psychological weapons on the Western Front created immediate tactical advantages, but also raised disturbing questions about the long-term implications of such conditioning. These soldiers showed no interest in normal human relationships, no emotional response to the death of comrades, and no apparent capacity for the psychological healing that allowed other veterans to eventually return to civilian life. Medical officers who examined these men reported physiological changes that seemed to accompany their psychological conditioning. Altered brainwave patterns, modified stress hormone responses, and changes in neurotransmitter production that appeared to be permanent. The conditioning process had created soldiers who were supremely adapted to warfare, but the adaptation had come at the cost of their fundamental humanity. As the war progressed, and these various programs produced increasing numbers of psychologically weaponized soldiers, a new phenomenon began to emerge on the Western Front. Units composed entirely of these conditioned men began to develop their own culture, their own communication methods, and their own understanding of their role in the conflict. They had become something entirely separate from the ordinary soldiers they fought alongside, a new breed of warrior that existed at the intersection of human and machine. The psychological transformation wasn't limited to individual soldiers. Entire units began exhibiting collective behaviors that defied conventional military understanding. These groups developed their own internal hierarchies, based not on rank or military protocol, but on demonstrated capacity for violence and psychological resilience. They communicated through subtle signals that bypassed normal military channels, creating networks of information and coordination that operated independently of official command structures. What emerged from this collective conditioning was something military historians would later struggle to categorize. These weren't traditional military units in any recognizable sense. They had evolved into something closer to hunting packs, bound together by shared psychological adaptations and a collective understanding of their role as instruments of warfare rather than human beings who happened to be fighting. The pack mentality manifested in disturbing ways during combat operations. These units would move through enemy positions with coordinated precision that seemed to transcend normal tactical training. They anticipated each other's actions with an accuracy that suggested some form of heightened group consciousness. Individual members would sacrifice themselves for tactical advantage without hesitation or apparent emotional distress, viewing their own lives as expendable resources in service of the group's effectiveness. Captain Maxwell Hartwell, a British intelligence officer who studied these phenomena, documented patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. "These soldiers have developed what can only be described as a collective mind," he wrote in classified reports. "They share information through methods we cannot fully understand and make tactical decisions that seem to emerge from group consensus rather than individual leadership. They have become something unprecedented in military history. The psychological conditioning had created soldiers who were no longer capable of functioning as individuals in any meaningful sense. They required constant contact with their specialized units to maintain psychological stability. When separated from their groups, they exhibited severe anxiety, disorientation, and often complete psychological breakdown. The conditioning process had made them supremely effective as weapons of war, but had also made them completely dependent on the military structure that had created them. This dependency became a critical weakness that enemy forces learned to exploit. German intelligence services developed tactics specifically designed to isolate these conditioned soldiers from their units, knowing that separation would render them psychologically vulnerable. Captured documents reveal systematic efforts to identify and target the communication networks that held these specialized units together. But the most disturbing development was the emergence of what military observers began calling spontaneous conditioning. Regular soldiers who spent extended periods fighting alongside these psychologically weaponized units began to exhibit similar behavioral patterns without undergoing formal conditioning programs. The transformation appeared to be contagious, spreading through proximity and shared combat experiences. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a military psychiatrist who treated soldiers during the final years of the war, documented this phenomenon in reports that remained classified until the 1980s. Normal soldiers exposed to conditioned units for extended periods begin to mirror their psychological adaptations, she wrote. The process appears to be accelerated by shared trauma and the psychological pressure to maintain effectiveness in combat. We are witnessing the emergence of a new form of psychological evolution driven by the extreme demands of industrial warfare. The contagious nature of the conditioning created cascading effects throughout entire divisions. Units that had initially contained only small numbers of psychologically weaponized soldiers gradually transformed until entire regiments exhibited the same disturbing behavioral patterns. Military commanders found themselves commanding forces that bore little resemblance to traditional armies, composed instead of men who had been systematically stripped of their humanity in service of tactical effectiveness. The second category of terrifying soldiers emerged from the underground war that raged beneath the Western Front. The tunneling companies represented a different kind of psychological adaptation, forged not by systematic conditioning, but by the unique horrors of subterranean combat. These men fought their battles in absolute darkness, surrounded by the constant threat of cave-ins, gas attacks, and countermining operations that could bury them alive without warning. The underground war began as a tactical necessity when surface advances became impossible. Both sides began digging elaborate tunnel systems designed to place explosive charges beneath enemy positions. But what started as an engineering project quickly evolved into something far more sinister. The tunnels became battlegrounds where men fought with primitive weapons in conditions that resembled medieval siege warfare more than modern military operations. Sergeant William Price, a veteran of the British tunneling companies, left a diary that captures the psychological toll of underground combat. Down here, he wrote, you lose track of time, of day and night, of everything that makes you feel human. The darkness gets inside your head and changes the way you think. After months underground, some of the lads started acting more like cave animals than soldiers. The selection process for tunneling companies initially focused on men with mining experience, but military commanders quickly discovered that traditional miners often broke down psychologically when forced to combine their technical skills with combat operations. The men who proved most effective were those who could adapt to living and fighting in conditions that violated every human instinct for safety and security. The tunneling soldiers developed enhanced senses that compensated for the perpetual darkness of their environment. They learned to identify different types of soil by touch, to detect enemy digging operations by sound, and to navigate complex underground networks using spatial memory that seemed to exceed normal human capabilities. But these adaptations came at the cost of their ability to function effectively on the surface. Private Thomas Mitchell, who spent 8 months with the Canadian tunneling companies, described the transformation in letters to his family. "We've become creatures of the dark," he wrote. "When they bring us up to the surface for rest periods, the sunlight hurts our eyes, and the open sky makes us feel exposed and vulnerable. Some of the lads refuse to sleep in surface bunkers anymore. They've dug themselves caves where they feel safe." The underground combat developed its own brutal culture and tactical methods. Fighting in tunnel systems required weapons and techniques that had been obsolete for centuries. Knives, clubs, and improvised spears became the primary tools of warfare. Hand-to-hand combat in narrow tunnels where movement was restricted and visibility was non-existent created psychological pressures that broke many soldiers completely. The tunneling companies also faced unique psychological challenges related to the constant threat of being buried alive. Cave-ins were a daily occurrence, often triggered by enemy explosive charges or artillery bombardments on the surface. Men who had survived multiple cave-ins developed an almost supernatural ability to sense structural weaknesses in tunnel systems, but they also exhibited symptoms that medical officers struggled to categorize. Lieutenant Colonel James Robertson, who commanded several tunneling operations, documented behavioral changes that seemed to transcend normal psychological adaptation. "These men have developed instincts that border on the supernatural," he wrote in classified reports. "They can sense danger in ways that seem to exceed normal human perception. But they've also lost the ability to function in normal social situations. They've become perfectly adapted to subterranean warfare, but completely alienated from surface life. The underground war created its own mythology and folklore. Tunneling soldiers reported encounters with things that couldn't be easily explained by conventional military doctrine. Strange sounds in abandoned tunnel sections. The discovery of ancient underground chambers that predated the war, and equipment that showed signs of interference by unknown forces, all contributed to a growing sense that the underground war was being fought in a realm that existed outside normal reality. Corporal David Hughes, who served with the Australian tunneling companies, left an account that captures the supernatural atmosphere of underground combat. "There are things down there that don't belong to either side," he wrote. "Sounds that aren't made by men or machines. Tunnels that appear on no maps and lead to places that shouldn't exist. Some of the lads claim they've seen things moving in the darkness that weren't German soldiers." The psychological conditioning required for effective underground combat created soldiers who were fundamentally different from their surface counterparts. They developed an intimate relationship with darkness and confined spaces that allowed them to remain calm and effective in conditions that would induce claustrophobia and panic in normal soldiers. But this adaptation isolated them from the rest of the military and from civilian society in ways that proved irreversible. Medical examinations of tunneling soldiers revealed physiological changes that seemed to accompany their psychological adaptation. Enhanced night vision, altered spatial perception, and modified stress responses that allowed them to function effectively in buried environments. But these same adaptations made them increasingly unsuited for life above ground, creating a population of soldiers who could only function effectively in the specific environment for which they had been psychologically conditioned. The tunneling companies also developed their own communication systems adapted to underground conditions. They learned to interpret vibrations through soil and rock, to identify different types of explosive charges by their acoustic signatures, and to coordinate complex operations using sound signals that could penetrate earth barriers. These communication skills created networks of information that operated independently of surface military channels. The underground war produced tactical innovations that influenced military thinking for decades afterward. Tunneling soldiers developed techniques for silent movement through enemy territory, for survival in collapsed tunnel systems, and for combat in confined spaces that would later be adapted for urban warfare and special operations. But the human cost of these innovations was soldiers who had been fundamentally altered by their adaptation to subterranean combat. As the war progressed, the tunneling companies began to operate with increasing independence from the surface military commands. They developed their own objectives, their own methods, and their own understanding of victory and defeat. They had become a separate military force operating according to rules and priorities that surface commanders could barely comprehend. The final phase of underground combat saw the emergence of what intelligence reports described as tunnel networks that seemed to operate according to their own logic. Complex underground cities that connected multiple battlefront sectors, populated by soldiers who had lost all connection to surface warfare and civilian life. These underground communities developed their own culture, their own hierarchy, and their own relationship to the war that surrounded them. The tunneling soldiers who emerged from these underground communities at the war's end represented perhaps the most complete psychological transformation produced by the conflict. They had become perfectly adapted to a form of warfare that existed outside normal human experience, but their adaptation had made them incapable of returning to the world they had fought to defend. The third and most disturbing category of terrifying soldiers emerged not from systematic training programs or environmental adaptation, but from complete psychological breakdown that somehow transformed into a different kind of combat effectiveness. These were the men who had been shattered so completely by the war that they had reassembled themselves into something that existed beyond normal human psychology. Military psychiatrists of the era struggled to classify these cases. They weren't traditional shell shock victims who had become incapacitated by trauma. Instead, they were soldiers who had experienced psychological destruction so complete that they had emerged on the other side as something entirely different. They had passed through madness and found a form of clarity that made them more dangerous than they had ever been as rational men. Dr. Henry Caldwell, chief psychiatrist for the British Expeditionary Force, documented these cases in reports that remained classified for over 50 years. "We are encountering soldiers who have experienced psychological breaks that should have rendered them unfit for combat," he wrote. Instead, these men have developed combat capabilities that exceed anything we have observed in normally functioning soldiers. They appear to have discovered a form of consciousness that is optimally adapted to the conditions of modern warfare. The transformation typically began with what appeared to be a standard case of acute stress reaction. A soldier would witness or experience trauma that exceeded his psychological capacity to process. The normal response would be catatonia, violent outbursts, or complete mental withdrawal. But in these unusual cases, the breakdown continued until something fundamental shifted in the soldier's relationship to reality itself. Private Edward Thompson, a Scottish infantryman who underwent this transformation, was observed and documented by medical officers over a period of several months. Initially, he had exhibited classic symptoms of severe shell shock following an artillery bombardment that killed his entire squad. He became mute, unresponsive to external stimuli, and required constant medical supervision. But after 3 weeks of apparent catatonia, Thompson began to change in ways that medical officers had never observed before. He started speaking, but only about tactical situations that seemed to exist in his imagination. He would describe enemy positions with precise detail, anticipate artillery bombardments that hadn't been scheduled, and provide intelligence about German troop movements that consistently proved accurate, despite his having no apparent access to such information. When Thompson was eventually returned to combat duty against medical advice, his effectiveness exceeded anything in his previous service record. He seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of battlefield dynamics that allowed him to anticipate enemy actions and respond with tactical precision that bordered on supernatural. But his behavior during combat operations unnerved both enemy and Allied forces. Lieutenant Marcus Williams, who commanded the unit that included Thompson, documented the soldiers' disturbing combat behavior. He fights with complete disregard for conventional tactics or personal safety, Williams wrote. He moves through enemy fire as if he knows exactly where each bullet will pass. He kills with mechanical efficiency, but shows no emotional response to violence. Most disturbing, he seems to enjoy conditions that terrify normal soldiers. Artillery bombardments calm him. The sight of corpses appears to comfort him. Similar cases began appearing throughout all armies on the Western Front. Soldiers who had been broken by trauma but had somehow reassembled themselves into more effective killing machines. These men shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from both normal soldiers and the systematically conditioned troops described earlier. They exhibited what psychiatrists termed inverted trauma response. Situations that would increase stress in normal soldiers actually improved their performance. They became more alert during artillery bombardments, more focused when surrounded by death and destruction, and more tactically effective when facing overwhelming odds. They had learned to draw energy from chaos rather than being depleted by it. Captain Frank Morrison, an American medical officer who studied these cases, documented psychological profiles that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. These soldiers have developed a relationship to violence and death that appears to be the opposite of normal human psychology, he wrote. They find peace in war and anxiety in safety. They have become perfectly adapted to conditions that destroy other men. But this adaptation has isolated them from everything that makes life meaningful to ordinary human beings. The inverted trauma response created soldiers who were supremely effective in combat, but completely unable to function in normal social situations. During rest periods, they exhibited severe anxiety and disorientation. They sought out dangerous situations during supposedly safe intervals, often volunteering for reconnaissance missions or other high-risk activities that allowed them to return to the psychological state where they felt comfortable. These soldiers also developed enhanced sensory capabilities that seemed to result from their psychological transformation. They could detect approaching artillery shells by sound before they became visible, identify enemy soldiers by scent in trenches filled with the smell of death and decay, and navigate battlefields in complete darkness with accuracy that suggested supernatural awareness of their environment. But the most unsettling aspect of these psychologically transformed soldiers was their effect on the men around them. Normal soldiers found their presence deeply disturbing. They radiated an aura of wrongness that made conversation difficult and rest impossible. They had become living reminders of what the war could do to human consciousness, walking examples of psychological transformation that went beyond anything covered in military training. The contagious nature of their condition became apparent when units containing these soldiers began to show elevated rates of psychological breakdown. Normal soldiers, exposed to their inverted worldview for extended periods, began to exhibit similar symptoms. The transformation appeared to spread through proximity and shared combat experience, creating clusters of psychologically altered soldiers within larger military units. Major General Sir Douglas Harrison, who commanded several divisions containing these transformed soldiers, documented their tactical effectiveness in reports that revealed both their military value and their human cost. These men represent the ultimate adaptation to modern warfare, he wrote. They have evolved beyond normal human limitations to become perfect instruments of destruction. But they have also evolved beyond normal human connection to become isolated from everything that gives life meaning outside of combat. The psychological transformation wasn't limited to individual soldiers. Units composed entirely of these trauma-evolved fighters developed collective behaviors that transcended normal military organization. They communicated through methods that bypassed verbal language, coordinating their actions through shared understanding that seemed to operate on an unconscious level. These units began to operate with increasing independence from normal military command structures. They developed their own objectives, pursued their own tactical goals, and made strategic decisions based on logic that normal commanders couldn't follow. They had become a military force that existed parallel to conventional armies, fighting the same war but according to entirely different principles. The Great War ended in November 1918, but for these transformed soldiers, the armistice brought no peace. They had become perfectly adapted to a world of perpetual violence, and the sudden absence of warfare left them psychologically adrift in a reality they could no longer comprehend. The stormtroopers, tunneling companies, and trauma-evolved fighters had transcended human limitations to become instruments of war. But that transcendence had severed their connection to the human world they had fought to defend. Military authorities faced an unprecedented challenge as these psychologically weaponized soldiers attempted to reintegrate into civilian society. Most proved incapable of forming normal relationships, holding conventional employment, or finding meaning in peacetime activities. They had been transformed so completely by their adaptation to warfare that they could only function effectively in environments that replicated the conditions of combat. The legacy of these terrifying soldiers extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the war. The psychological conditioning techniques developed during the conflict became the foundation for special operations training programs that continue to this day. The understanding that human consciousness could be systematically modified to create more effective warriors influenced military thinking throughout the 20th century and beyond. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy was the demonstration that human nature itself could be weaponized. The Great War had proven that with sufficient psychological pressure, ordinary men could be transformed into something that transcended normal human limitations. The techniques that created these terrifying soldiers revealed capabilities within human consciousness that military authorities had never suspected existed. The classified reports, hidden diaries, and sealed testimonies that document these transformations remain largely unknown to the general public. Official military histories sanitize the reality of what these men became, focusing on tactical innovations rather than the human cost of creating psychological weapons. The truth about the most terrifying soldiers of World War I continues to be buried beneath layers of secrecy and institutional denial. Today, as we face new forms of warfare and technological capabilities that seem to exceed human comprehension, the story of these transformed soldiers serves as both warning and prophecy. The Great War demonstrated that there are no limits to what human beings will do to each other when survival is at stake, and no boundaries that won't be crossed in the pursuit of military advantage. The men who became living nightmares on the battlefields of Europe remind us that the greatest horror of war isn't death itself, but what it can do to the human soul. In their transformation from ordinary soldiers into psychological weapons, we see reflected our own capacity for adaptation to unthinkable circumstances, and the price that such adaptation demands from our fundamental humanity.